Late July 2026. Theaters worldwide brace for the premiere of Spider-Man: Brand New Day. It is a cinematic event engineered to command attention, a massive demand signal proving that a single superhero can anchor a global studio balance sheet. But behind the marketing campaigns, the licensing contracts, and the projected billion-dollar box office lies a corporate ghost story. The real mystery of Spider-Man does not live on the screen. It hides inside a closed-door meeting in Culver City, California, in the spring of 1998. At that exact moment, Marvel Entertainment is bleeding out. They're crawling from the wreckage of a brutal bankruptcy, desperate to liquidate their only remaining untethered assets, the theatrical rights to their comic book characters. Sony Pictures sits across the table, holding the leverage and the cash. Marvel offers them a cinematic universe for the price of a mid-budget romantic comedy. For $25 million, Sony can secure the film rights to almost the entire remaining Marvel roster: Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, Black Panther. Sony executives examine the offer. They look at their spreadsheets, apply the standard risk models of late 90s Hollywood, and determine that those secondary characters are mathematically worthless. They only want the web-slinger. They counter with $10 million for Spider-Man alone. This single calculation, the institutional decision to price an unbuilt empire at zero, permanently alters the modern entertainment economy. The title means Sony declined a $25 million package for Marvel's remaining character film rights. It does not mean they were offered ownership of the Marvel company itself, nor does it guarantee the Marvel Cinematic Universe would have materialized under Sony. But the rejection triggers a chain reaction. It is a story about asset valuation, extreme financial leverage, and the institutional blindness that prevents a traditional corporate machine from recognizing a new ecosystem.
To understand how a major corporation could look at a multi-billion-dollar asset and see only a liability, you have to examine the mechanical reality of Hollywood in the late 1990s. The industry operates on a rigid, star-driven risk model. Intellectual property is only considered valuable if it possesses immediate, undeniable mainstream recognition. Batman and Superman have proven track records, though even they show signs of fatigue after high-profile failures. The rest of the comic book medium is viewed as a radioactive wasteland of niche obsessions. Marvel Entertainment is living this nightmare in real time. By 1996, the comic book speculation bubble violently bursts. Marvel files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, igniting a vicious boardroom war for control of the company's scraps. Financiers like Ron Perlman and Carl Icahn fight bitterly over the remaining equity, while the core business of printing paper comics continues to hemorrhage cash. Out of this wreckage emerged toy executives Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad. They managed to take control of Marvel, but they inherit a structurally broken enterprise. They need capital immediately just to keep the lights on. Their inventory of physical products is depreciating, but they realize they hold a vast, largely unexploited registry of intellectual property. The problem is that Hollywood studios treat these characters not as assets, but as enormous cost centers. Producing a superhero film requires massive upfront capital expenditure for special effects, followed by tens of millions of dollars in marketing just to explain to the public who the character is. Why would a studio spend $50 million trying to convince audiences to care about a guy in an iron suit when they could just hire Tom Cruise to play a spy? The math simply does not work. Sony Pictures, a sprawling corporate behemoth heavily reliant on its electronics parent company, is hunting for a reliable, recurring summer blockbuster franchise. They identify Spider-Man as the sole Marvel property with enough inherent brand equity to justify a massive production budget. Spider-Man is a known variable. He moves merchandise. He is safe. Sony dispatches a young, ambitious executive named Yair Landau to negotiate with Marvel. Landau is tasked with securing the rights to Peter Parker, unaware that he is about to be offered the keys to a kingdom his superiors have absolutely no interest in ruling. The blind spot is not a lack of intelligence, it is an over-reliance on historical data. Sony looks at past performance to predict future value, entirely missing the structural shift that digital effects and interconnected storytelling are about to unleash on the global box office.
The negotiation room in 1998 becomes the collision point between a desperate seller and a highly risk-averse buyer.
Yair Landau sits down with Marvel's newly minted leadership, who are acutely aware of their weak bargaining position. Marvel needs cash, and they know Sony has deep pockets. But instead of just handing over Spider-Man, Marvel's executives propose a radical package deal. They recognize that selling off characters piecemeal leaves them vulnerable, holding a roster of unknown heroes that no other studio will touch. So they bundle the rights. For a flat fee of $25 million, Sony can take almost everything. The package includes the theatrical rights to Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, Black Panther, and a host of other characters. It is an unprecedented fire sale of intellectual property. Landau, recognizing the sheer volume of material being offered for a relatively trivial sum, takes the proposal back to his superiors at Sony Pictures. The response he receives is now etched into the bedrock of entertainment business history. The senior executives evaluate the package through the lens of their quarterly earnings targets and their established marketing formulas. They do not see a pantheon of modern mythology. They see dozens of expensive, high-risk launch campaigns for characters that middle America has never heard of. One Sony executive famously summarizes the institutional consensus, telling Landau that nobody gives a single damn about any of the other Marvel characters. They order him to go back and reject the bundle. The counteroffer is brutally precise: $10 million for the theatrical rights to Spider-Man alone. Sony wants the sure thing. They buy the anchor and throw the rest of the ship back into the ocean. This is a highly rational decision based on the incentives of a corporate manager in 1998. Buying the extra characters would require explaining to the parent company in Tokyo why millions are being spent on obscure comic book heroes while the studio is already taking a massive financial risk on Spider-Man. Survival in a corporate hierarchy depends on defending your acquisitions. Spider-Man is defensible. Iron Man is a career-ending liability. Landau returns to Marvel and delivers the final terms. Marvel, having no other viable suitors and staring down the barrel of insolvency, accepts the $10 million. The contract is signed. Sony walks away with their golden goose, confident they have executed a perfect, risk-minimized transaction. They have absolutely no idea they have just armed a time bomb. The immediate aftermath validates Sony's strategy flawlessly. In 2002, Sony releases Spider-Man. The film shatters box office records, becoming the first movie to cross $100 million in its opening weekend. It validates the studio's risk model, injects massive liquidity into Sony Pictures, and establishes a franchise that will anchor their balance sheet for decades. Marvel, meanwhile, receives only a tiny fraction of that revenue due to the structure of the licensing agreement. They watch from the sidelines as other studios make billions off their creations. Fox has the X-Men, Sony has Spider-Man, New Line has Blade. Marvel is surviving, but they are not scaling. They are trapped in a low-margin licensing model, holding a roster of leftover characters that the entire industry explicitly deemed worthless. But this rejection, this exact state of being locked out of the premium studio system, forces a structural mutation inside Marvel. Because no one will buy their secondary heroes, Marvel realizes they have to manufacture the films themselves. The barrier to entry is capital. They need hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have a terrible credit rating. Enter David Maisel, a former Endeavor agent who joins Marvel with a completely different financial vision. Maisel looks at the discarded characters and sees a cohesive, unexploited ecosystem. He pitches Marvel on a terrifying strategy: stop licensing, build an independent studio, finance the movies internally, retain full creative control, and keep 100% of the profits. To achieve this, Maisel engineers one of the most audacious financial maneuvers in Hollywood history. In 2005, he secures a $525 million debt facility from Merrill Lynch. The structure of this loan is the critical mechanism. It is non-recourse debt. This means that if the movies fail, Merrill Lynch cannot seize Marvel's core comic book business or its existing toy revenues. Instead, the collateral for the loan is the film rights to the characters themselves. 10 characters are put up as collateral, including Captain America, the Avengers, Nick Fury, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and Doctor Strange. It is a massive gamble. Marvel is betting its remaining intellectual property on a concept that Sony laughed at 7 years earlier. If their first independent movie fails, the banks will foreclose on the characters, and Marvel's cinematic future will be entirely wiped out. The pressure is existential. They choose Iron Man as their first test case, a character widely considered a secondary hero at the time. They cast Robert Downey Jr.,
an actor viewed as an uninsurable risk by traditional studio metrics. They build the film not as an isolated product, but as the first node in a theoretical network. And then, everything connects. In 2008, Iron Man opens to massive critical and commercial success. It does not just make money, it proves that audiences will embrace the exact characters that Sony discarded. The Merrill Lynch debt facility allows Marvel to retain the equity, proving the viability of an interconnected universe. A year later, the Walt Disney Company buys Marvel for $4 billion. The characters Sony refused to buy for $15 million extra are now the foundation of the most lucrative intellectual property acquisition in modern history. The Marvel Cinematic Universe goes on to generate over $30 billion in global box office revenue.
The compounding math of this ecosystem leaves Sony in a bizarre strategic trap. They own the most famous character, but they are entirely isolated. They are forced to continually reboot and repackage Spider-Man, stretching the single asset to its absolute breaking point to sustain their studio slate, while Marvel builds an empire out of the scraps they left behind. Asset valuation is never an objective science. It is always a mirror reflecting the specific fears and incentives of its time. Sony Pictures was not run by foolish people. The executives who rejected the $25 million Marvel bundle acted perfectly rationally within the institutional logic of 1998. They optimized for immediate safety, avoiding the unquantifiable risk of unproven characters. But in doing so, they exposed the fatal flaw of traditional corporate accounting. Spreadsheets can measure the historical revenue of a known commodity, but they cannot price the latent value of a connected ecosystem. Sony treated intellectual property as a series of isolated physical factories. If one factory did not have a proven track record, it was deemed a bad investment. Marvel, forced into a corner by their own bankruptcy and Sony's rejection, learned to treat their characters not as isolated factories, but as software. Each character was a node in a network, and the value of the network increased exponentially as more nodes were connected. The Merrill Lynch debt facility was the capital that allowed that network to boot up. Today, as massive crowds prepare to watch Spider-Man Brand New Day, Sony Pictures reaps the immediate financial rewards of their 1998 purchase. But they do so knowing that they are merely renting space in a cultural phenomenon that they could have owned outright. They hold a single highly profitable piece of a puzzle, forever excluded from the wider board. The legacy of that closed-door meeting is a chilling reminder for any institution trying to quantify the future. When an organization demands historical proof for an unprecedented idea, it guarantees its own blindness. What other massive, invisible empires are currently sitting on a negotiating table, being priced at zero